When the woman he loved closed the door behind her, Marshall Owe still believed he could get everything back. The money, the companies, the reputation. He stood alone inside a penthouse that had once hosted celebrities, politicians, and investors who fought for a seat at his table. Hours earlier, he had been reading headlines about his own collapse. By midnight, he was staring at a wedding photo, realizing that the fortune he spent 30 years building had disappeared in less than 6 months. But the number in his bank account wasn't what frightened him. It was the silence. The silence from friends who stopped calling. The silence from business partners who vanished. The silence from the woman who once promised she would stand beside him no matter what happened. Marshall thought losing billions would be the hardest part of his downfall. He was wrong, because within the next year, a stranger would appear carrying a secret connected to a decision Marshall had made more than 20 years earlier. A decision so small he barely remembered it. Yet it would become the reason his life changed forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 2 years earlier, Marshall Owe was worth more than $2 billion. His private jet sat waiting on airport runways across the country. His companies employed thousands of people. Business magazines called him one of the most influential entrepreneurs in America. Financial networks analyzed his decisions. Young founders studied his interviews. Investors followed his every move. From the outside, Marshall appeared to have achieved the kind of success most people only dream about. The houses, the cars, the influence, the attention, all of it seemed permanent. Yet history has shown again and again that fortunes can disappear much faster than they are built. Entire empires have fallen because of one bad decision, one economic shock, or one moment of overconfidence. Marshall did not believe it could happen to him. Like many successful people before him, he thought he had planned for every possibility. He believed his empire was strong enough to survive anything. He would soon learn how quickly certainty can disappear. The first signs were easy to ignore. A delayed deal. An unexpected loss. A few nervous conversations inside boardrooms where confidence had always come naturally. Marshall dismissed them as temporary setbacks. After all, he had faced obstacles before. Throughout his career, he had turned problems into opportunities. He had built his reputation on doing what others thought was impossible. But this time was different. The challenges weren't arriving one at a time. They were arriving all at once. Markets shifted. Investors became cautious. Credit tightened. Projects that looked unstoppable suddenly looked fragile. Every week seemed to bring another problem demanding immediate attention. Every solution seemed to create 2 new problems. The pressure grew quietly at first, then all at once. And while Marshall fought to save his businesses, another part of his life was beginning to break apart in ways that no financial expert could measure. His wife, Claire, had spent years standing beside him during charity events, award ceremonies, and glamorous celebrations. To the public, they looked inseparable. Their photographs appeared in magazines. Their vacations attracted attention online. People admired their story. Few understood what life inside the marriage had become. Success had changed Marshall. The long hours became longer. Family dinners became business meetings. Promises became postponements. Claire had spent years convincing herself things would improve once the next deal closed or the next milestone was reached. Instead, the distance between them continued to grow. When the financial crisis struck Marshall's empire, it exposed problems that had existed long before the money started disappearing. The arguments became more frequent. The trust became harder to repair. Then one evening, after another difficult conversation, Claire said something Marshall would remember for the rest of his life. She told him that she no longer recognized the man she had married. At the time, Marshall thought those words were spoken out of frustration. Months later, he would realize they were a warning. Then came the collapse. Headlines spread across financial news outlets. Analysts questioned decisions that had once been praised. Investors demanded answers. Lawsuits appeared. Assets were frozen. Projects stopped. Employees worried about their futures. Reporters gathered outside buildings that had once symbolized Marshall's success. Every day seemed to bring another loss. Millions became hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions became billions. Numbers that once felt impossible now appeared on documents sitting directly in front of him. The empire that took decades to build was unraveling at a speed Marshall could barely comprehend. Yet even then, he believed he could recover. He believed there would be another opportunity, another breakthrough, another chance to rebuild. What he didn't know was that the greatest turning point in his story would not come from a boardroom, a bank, or an investor. It would come from a stranger he had never expected to see again. And to understand how Marshall Oahe went from billionaire to sleeping on a park bench, we have to go back to where it all began. Marshall Oahe wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't the son of a famous businessman, a Wall Street legend, or the heir to a family fortune. 25 years earlier, he had been just another young man with ambition, a used pickup truck, and a belief that hard work could change his future. While others chased quick money, Marshall became obsessed with building something that would last. He worked longer hours than anyone around him. He slept in offices. He missed weekends. He sacrificed comfort for opportunity. The risks he took were enormous, but they paid off. One company became two. Two became five. Before long, Marshall had built a business empire that stretched across multiple industries. Financial magazines praised his vision. Television hosts invited him onto their programs. Universities asked him to speak to future entrepreneurs. Everywhere he went, people wanted to know the secret behind his success. As his fortune grew, so did his reputation. Marshall wasn't known only as a billionaire. He was known as a success story. Local newspapers celebrated his donations to schools and hospitals. Community leaders praised his charitable contributions. Scholarship programs carried his company's name. At charity galas, guests lined up to shake his hand. Young entrepreneurs viewed him as proof that determination could still create extraordinary success. To the public, Marshall represented the American dream. He seemed to have everything people aspire to achieve: wealth, influence, respect, a beautiful family, a thriving business empire. Whenever reporters asked him about success, Marshall would smile and say that anything was possible for someone willing to work hard enough. Millions believed him because his life appeared to be living proof. But success often hides problems that nobody sees. The larger Marshall's empire became, the more demanding it was to maintain. His calendar filled with meetings, flights, negotiations, and endless responsibilities. One deal led to another. One acquisition created new opportunities. One expansion required another. Every year brought greater rewards, but also greater pressure. Marshall convinced himself that all the sacrifices were temporary. He told himself that once he reached the next milestone, things would slow down. Yet every achievement only raised the stakes. Every victory created new expectations. The life he had built no longer belonged entirely to him. It belonged to shareholders, executives, investors, and employees who depended on his decisions. Without realizing it, Marshall had become a prisoner of the very success he once dreamed about. At home, Claire noticed the changes long before anyone else did. In the early years, they celebrated milestones together. They shared dreams, plans, and long conversations about the future. But as Marshall's wealth increased, his attention became harder to find. Business dinners replaced family dinners. Important phone calls interrupted vacations. Birthdays became rushed obligations squeezed between meetings. Claire tried to be patient. She understood the demands of Marshall's career better than most people. Yet understanding something and accepting it are two different things. Over time, the distance between them grew. Marshall remained physically present, but emotionally he seemed somewhere else entirely. Every conversation felt shorter. Every promise felt delayed. Every year seemed to take him further away from the people who loved him most. What made the situation worse was that Marshall didn't see it happening. From his perspective, he was working hard for his family's future. He believed every sacrifice had a purpose. Every late night, every missed event, every postponed vacation. He told himself that one day his family would appreciate everything he was building for them. What he failed to understand was that people rarely measure love by future promises. They measure it by presence. While Marshall focused on expanding his empire, the relationships closest to him slowly weakened. Claire wasn't asking for luxury. She already had that. She wasn't asking for status. She already had that too. What she wanted was something money couldn't buy: time, attention, connection. The more successful Marshall became, the less of those things he seemed able to give. Then there was another change, one even fewer people noticed. Success had started to affect the way Marshall viewed himself. The praise, admiration, and constant validation became difficult to ignore. Everywhere he went, people treated him like the smartest person in the room. His predictions were celebrated. His decisions were praised. His confidence grew stronger with every success. At first, it helped him. Confidence had always been one of his greatest strengths. But confidence can become dangerous when it turns into certainty. Marshall gradually stopped questioning himself. He listened less. He trusted his instincts more than advice. He became convinced that because he had been right so many times before, he would continue being right in the future. The warning signs that might have concerned him years earlier now seemed insignificant. He believed he could solve any problem because he always had. Meanwhile, the public continued seeing only the polished version of Marshall Oahe. The billionaire, the philanthropist, the visionary entrepreneur, the smiling face on magazine covers. Nobody saw the growing tension inside his marriage. Nobody saw the exhaustion hidden behind closed office doors. Nobody saw the pressure building beneath the surface of his empire. And nobody saw how quickly circumstances were about to change. Because while Marshall was standing at the peak of success, forces were already moving against him. Decisions made months earlier were beginning to create consequences he never anticipated. Deals that looked brilliant on paper were becoming increasingly fragile. Financial risks that once seemed manageable were becoming harder to control. And what nobody knew was that the foundation of Marshall's empire was already beginning to crack. To the outside world, Marshall and Claire Oahe looked like the definition of a successful marriage. Their wedding photos still appeared in magazines years after the ceremony. They attended charity galas together. They walked red carpets side by side. Social media captured smiling vacations, elegant dinners, and celebrations that seemed to confirm they were living a dream most people could only imagine. Whenever reporters interviewed Marshall about success, he often mentioned Claire's support. Whenever friends spoke about the couple, they described them as inseparable. Their lives appeared carefully built, polished, and secure. Yet the image people admired was becoming increasingly different from reality. The truth was that while Marshall's empire was growing stronger in public, his marriage was growing weaker in private. The problems didn't appear overnight. They arrived gradually, hidden inside everyday moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Claire had spent years supporting Marshall's ambitions. She understood the sacrifices required to build something extraordinary. She had stood beside him during difficult years when success was uncertain and money was limited. Back then, they shared every challenge together. They celebrated small victories because they had earned them together. But as the years passed and Marshall's wealth multiplied, their priorities began moving in different directions. Marshall remained focused on growth, expansion, and new opportunities. Claire began caring more about family, stability, and the life they had already built. Neither of them was entirely wrong. The problem was that neither truly understood how far apart they were drifting. As Marshall's responsibilities increased, Claire often found herself attending events alone. Important family occasions were interrupted by business calls. Vacations were shortened because of urgent meetings. Promises were made with good intentions and broken because of scheduling conflicts. At first, Claire accepted the explanations. She believed things would improve once the next deal was completed. Then she believed things would improve after the next acquisition. Then after the next expansion. Years passed, and the improvements never came. What frustrated Claire most wasn't Marshall's workload. It was the feeling that everything else always came first. Every conversation seemed to revolve around business. Every future plan seemed connected to another professional goal. The more successful Marshall became, the more invisible Claire began to feel. Their disagreements became more frequent. Small arguments turned into larger ones. Conversations that once ended with understanding now ended with silence. Claire wanted Marshall to slow down and enjoy the life they had worked so hard to create. Marshall viewed slowing down as a risk. He believed success required constant momentum. He feared that taking his foot off the accelerator would allow competitors to catch up. What Claire saw as balance, Marshall saw as complacency. What Marshall saw as ambition, Claire increasingly viewed as obsession. Neither realized that the gap between their perspectives was becoming harder to bridge. Then financial disagreements entered the marriage. Ironically, they began while Marshall was still worth billions. Claire noticed that many of Marshall's newer investments carried greater risks than before. She heard conversations about leverage, debt, and expansion strategies that seemed far more aggressive than the decisions that had built his fortune. Marshall remained confident. He believed opportunities like these separated great entrepreneurs from ordinary ones. Claire wasn't convinced. She worried that success had made him overconfident. The discussions often ended the same way. Marshall would insist he understood the risks. Claire would warn him that confidence and certainty were not the same thing. Neither changed the other's mind. As the tension increased, something else disappeared from the marriage. The ability to talk openly. Conversations became shorter. Defensiveness replaced honesty. Resentment quietly accumulated on both sides. Claire felt unheard. Marshall felt unappreciated. Instead of solving problems together, they began facing them separately. The partnership that had once helped them overcome obstacles now seemed unable to survive ordinary disagreements. Friends noticed subtle changes, but assumed they were temporary. Publicly, Marshall and Claire continued presenting the same image everyone expected to see. Privately, they were becoming strangers living under the same roof. Then came a conversation neither of them knew would become a turning point. It happened late one evening after another argument about Marshall's business decisions. The discussion started like many before it, but this time Claire refused to let it end with another promise. She looked directly at Marshall and asked a question he wasn't prepared to answer. If everything disappeared tomorrow, who would you be without the money? Marshall immediately dismissed the question. He told her she was worrying about impossible scenarios. He reminded her of everything he had built and everything he still planned to accomplish. But Claire wasn't talking about business. She was talking about identity. About purpose, about what remained when success was stripped away. Before leaving the room, she said something that would later haunt Marshall more than losing his fortune. She told him that one day he might discover the difference between people who loved him and people who loved what he had become. At the time, Marshall barely thought about those words. He believed the future was secure. He believed his empire was too strong to fail. He believed his marriage would survive because it always had before. What he didn't realize was that events were already in motion. Decisions made months earlier were beginning to create consequences. Markets were shifting. Investors were becoming nervous. Financial pressure was building in places he couldn't yet see. Then the first domino fell. The first signs of trouble appeared on a Monday morning. Marshall Oae had walked into a routine executive meeting expecting updates on quarterly growth projections. Instead, he was greeted by worried faces and numbers that made no sense. One of the company's largest investments had suddenly begun losing value at a pace nobody anticipated. Analysts who had been optimistic only weeks earlier were now issuing warnings. Senior executives assured Marshall the situation could be managed. Temporary setbacks were part of business. Markets moved up and down all the time. Marshall had survived difficult periods before, and he believed this challenge would be no different. As the meeting ended, he instructed his team to remain calm and focus on solutions. What nobody realized was that this wasn't an isolated problem. It was the beginning of a chain reaction that would eventually threaten everything Marshall had spent decades building. During the first month, the damage appeared manageable. Investors asked questions, but most remained supportive. Financial media reported concerns, but the headlines were not yet alarming. Marshall spent nearly every waking hour working to stabilize the situation. Emergency meetings filled his schedule. Calls with lenders stretched late into the night. Teams were assigned to evaluate risks and reassure stakeholders. Publicly, Marshall projected confidence. He appeared on interviews insisting that the company remained strong. Behind closed doors, however, the numbers continued moving in the wrong direction. Projects that had once generated reliable profits suddenly became liabilities. Funding sources grew cautious. Long-standing partners delayed commitments. Every solution seemed to require additional money at the exact moment. Cash was becoming harder to secure. By the second month, the crisis had become impossible to hide. A former executive publicly questioned several strategic decisions that had contributed to the company's exposure. Reporters quickly seized the story. Financial networks debated Marshall's leadership. Newspapers published articles examining risks that had gone largely unnoticed during the company's years of success. Investors who once praised Marshall's vision now questioned his judgment. Rumors spread faster than facts. Competitors quietly used the uncertainty to their advantage. Every day brought another damaging headline. Every week seemed to introduce another challenge. Marshall found himself spending more time defending past decisions than planning future ones. The confidence that had once defined him was beginning to show signs of strain. Then came the lawsuits. Shareholders accused executives of failing to disclose important risks. Business partners sought legal protection from potential losses. Government regulators began reviewing transactions connected to the company's recent expansion efforts. Lawyers occupied conference rooms that had previously hosted growth discussions. Accountants examined records. Consultants delivered grim assessments. The atmosphere inside Marshall's headquarters changed completely. Conversations that once focused on opportunity now centered on survival. Employees worried about layoffs. Managers worried about budgets. Executives worried about outcomes nobody wanted to discuss openly. For the first time in years, Marshall faced a problem he couldn't solve simply by working harder. The third month brought losses on a scale few people could comprehend. Hundreds of millions disappeared. Then more. Assets that had once been considered valuable became difficult to sell. Creditors demanded answers. Financial institutions tightened restrictions. Investors who had remained patient began pulling away. Marshall watched as decades of progress seemed to unravel in real time. Every report delivered worse news than the one before it. Every projection required another downward revision. Friends who once eagerly returned his calls suddenly became difficult to reach. Business relationships built over years weakened under pressure. The circle of people surrounding Marshall grew smaller with each passing week. At home, the stress became impossible to ignore. Claire saw a man she barely recognized. Marshall slept less. He ate less. Conversations became shorter and more tense. Every room seemed filled with financial documents, legal reports, and urgent messages demanding immediate attention. The pressure consumed nearly every aspect of his life. Yet despite everything happening around him, Marshall still believed he could reverse the situation. He had spent years overcoming obstacles. He convinced himself this crisis would eventually become another chapter in his success story. What he didn't understand was that events had already moved beyond his control. Then came the fourth month. The month everything changed. Lenders froze critical lines of credit. Major assets were locked in legal disputes. Emergency funding efforts failed. Executives privately discussed scenarios that only weeks earlier would have seemed impossible. Bankruptcy, once unthinkable, became a realistic threat. News organizations reported that Marshall's empire stood on the edge of collapse. Investors rushed for exits. Markets reacted immediately. Confidence disappeared almost overnight. The image of the untouchable billionaire shattered before the entire world. Marshall sat alone in his office one evening staring at a city skyline he had once viewed as a symbol of limitless opportunity. For years, those lights represented growth, ambition, and success. Now they seemed distant. The empire he had dedicated his life to was slipping away. His reputation was under attack. His fortune was disappearing. His future had become uncertain. But losing billions wasn't the worst thing that happened. For months, Marshall Oahe had convinced himself that the crisis consuming his business would eventually pass. Every morning, he woke up believing there was still a path back. A deal that could be saved. An investor who could be persuaded. A solution he simply hadn't discovered yet. That belief was often the only thing keeping him moving. Even as his fortune disappeared and his reputation suffered, he still had something he considered unshakable. Claire. Whatever problems existed in their marriage, Marshall assumed they would survive this together. After all, they had spent years building a life side by side. They had weathered challenges before. They shared memories, dreams, and a history that stretched back long before the private jets and luxury estates. Marshall believed that if everything else collapsed, his marriage would remain standing. He was wrong. The moment arrived on a cold evening just days after another devastating financial setback. Marshall returned home later than usual. The mansion felt unusually quiet. No television, no music, no voices. The silence immediately felt different. As he walked through the hallway, he noticed several framed photographs missing from their usual places. Decorative pieces had disappeared. Drawers stood partially open. A strange feeling settled in his stomach. Then he entered the master bedroom. Several suitcases were lined up near the door. For a few seconds, he simply stared. His mind searched for explanations that made sense. Maybe Claire was visiting family. Maybe she was traveling. Maybe there was some reason he hadn't been told. Then he saw her standing near the window. Claire looked calm. Too calm. Not angry. Not emotional. Just certain. And somehow that certainty frightened Marshall more than anything else. He asked the question even though part of him already knew the answer. What's going on? Claire looked at him for a long moment before speaking. I can't do this anymore, Marshall. The words landed harder than any financial loss he had experienced. Marshall immediately began searching for solutions, just as he did in business. They could talk. They could work things out. They could take time away together. They could fix whatever had broken between them. But Claire slowly shook her head. This wasn't a sudden decision. This wasn't an emotional reaction. This was something she had been carrying for a very long time. She explained that she no longer recognized the life they were living. Years earlier, she had fallen in love with a man who dreamed of building something meaningful. Somewhere along the way, that dream had become an obsession. Every achievement created another goal. Every success created another pursuit. There was always another deal, another acquisition, another reason to postpone what mattered most. Marshall tried defending himself. Everything he had done was for their future. Everything he built was meant to benefit their family. Claire listened quietly before responding. The problem wasn't what he built. The problem was what he sacrificed to build it. As the conversation continued, old frustrations surfaced. Missed anniversaries, broken promises, vacations interrupted by business emergencies. Moments that seemed insignificant to Marshall but unforgettable to Claire. One by one, they formed a picture Marshall had never fully allowed himself to see. The distance hadn't appeared during the collapse. It had existed long before the money disappeared. The collapse had simply exposed it. Then Claire walked to a nearby table and picked up a folder. Inside was a copy of their prenuptial agreement. Marshall immediately understood what she was trying to communicate. She wasn't leaving because she wanted money. She wasn't fighting for assets. She wasn't demanding anything. She simply wanted out. That realization hurt more than if she had asked for everything. Because it meant this decision wasn't about wealth. It was about him. Marshall felt something he hadn't felt in years. Helplessness. There were no negotiations to lead. No contracts to rewrite. No investors to convince. No strategy capable of changing her mind. For the first time in decades, he faced a problem his influence could not solve. As Claire picked up her final suitcase, Marshall asked the question that had been growing louder in his mind throughout the entire conversation. Are you really leaving now? The question wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about timing. It was about everything. After all these years. After everything they had built together. After everything they had survived. Now, when he had already lost so much. Claire stopped near the doorway. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she turned toward him one final time. Her answer would stay with Marshall long after the mansion, the businesses, and the fortune were gone. She said, I didn't leave because you lost your money, Marshall. I left because somewhere along the way, I lost you. Then she walked out. The door closed. And just like that, the house that once felt alive suddenly felt enormous and empty. Marshall stood motionless in the silence. The financial losses had been painful. The headlines had been humiliating. The lawsuits had been exhausting. But none of them compared to this. For the first time since the collapse began, he truly understood what it meant to be alone. His phone barely rang anymore. His business partners were distancing themselves. His investors had lost confidence. Now Claire was gone too. The woman who had stood beside him through the rise of his empire was no longer there. Hours later, Marshall found himself sitting alone in the darkness, staring at an old wedding photograph that Claire had accidentally left behind. Or perhaps intentionally. He couldn't tell. What he did know was that the life he once believed was permanent had disappeared piece by piece. And the losses weren't over yet. Because within weeks, he would lose the last thing he still believed he had. The final blow arrived quietly. There was no dramatic announcement. No television cameras. No breaking news banner flashing across a screen. After months of legal battles, frozen assets, failed negotiations, and mounting pressure from creditors, the last pieces of Marshall Oae's financial empire slipped beyond his control. Properties were sold. Accounts were restricted. Investments disappeared. The wealth that had once seemed limitless became a collection of documents recording what used to exist. For years, Marshall had measured success through numbers. Revenue, growth, net worth, market value. Now those same numbers told a very different story. Within a matter of weeks, his lifestyle changed completely. The private jet was gone. The luxury vehicles were gone. The penthouse that overlooked the city skyline was gone. Even the expensive watch he had worn for years eventually found its way into a pawn shop display case. Marshall remembered standing there as the employee examined it under bright lights. The watch had once represented achievement, success, status. Now it represented groceries, temporary shelter, and another few days of survival. The amount offered was a fraction of what it had originally cost. Marshall accepted without negotiating. Months earlier, he would have considered the experience unimaginable. Now he simply took the money and walked away. What surprised him most wasn't the financial hardship. It was how quickly people disappeared. Former colleagues who once requested meetings suddenly became unavailable. Business associates stopped returning messages. People who once treated Marshall like the most important person in the room barely acknowledged him. At first, he tried reaching out. Then he stopped. Each unanswered call revealed the same painful lesson. Many relationships he thought were genuine had been connected to his success. Without the empire, the invitations vanished. Without the fortune, the attention vanished. Without the influence, so did many of the people surrounding him. The realization hurt more than any headline. For the first time in decades, Marshall moved through the city without attracting attention. Nobody recognized him. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked for advice. Nobody cared. The man who had once commanded boardrooms full of executives had become invisible. And invisibility can be a lonely thing. As the weeks passed, Marshall developed routines that would have seemed impossible during his billionaire years. He spent time in public libraries because they were warm and quiet. He walked for hours because transportation cost money. Some nights were spent in shelters. Other nights were spent wherever he could find safety and a few hours of rest. Every day became focused on immediate concerns rather than long-term plans. Food, shelter, survival. One afternoon, after another discouraging morning searching for temporary work, Marshall found himself sitting alone on a weathered bench in Marcus Garvey Park. The sky was gray. A cold breeze moved through the trees. People passed by without looking at him. Parents pushed strollers. Workers hurried toward offices. Joggers moved along nearby pathways. Everyone seemed to have somewhere important to be. Marshall sat quietly, watching the world continue without him. It was a strange feeling. Years earlier, he had believed the world revolved around his decisions. Now it barely seemed aware he existed. As he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushed against a few crumpled bills. $17. That was all he had left. He stared at the money for several seconds. 2 years earlier, financial publications had estimated his fortune at more than $2 billion. Now he was calculating how many meals $17 could buy. The contrast would have been almost unbelievable if he wasn't living it himself. Marshall lowered his head and closed his eyes. The exhaustion wasn't physical anymore. It was emotional. The constant disappointment. The isolation. The memories of everything he had lost. For a brief moment, he wondered whether Claire had been right all along. Maybe he had spent so much time building an empire that he failed to build a life. Then he heard something. A faint rattling sound. Metal wheels moving unevenly across concrete. Marshall looked up. A small food cart was approaching along the pathway. The woman pushing it appeared ordinary at first glance. Middle-aged. Simple clothing. No signs of wealth or status. She moved slowly but with purpose. Marshall paid little attention. Food vendors passed through the park regularly. But as the cart drew closer, something unusual happened. The woman suddenly stopped. Not near him. Directly in front of him. Marshall looked around instinctively, assuming she must be waiting for someone else. There was nobody there. Just him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The woman simply stared. Her eyes never left his face. There was no confusion in her expression. No uncertainty. No hesitation. She looked at Marshall the way someone looks at a person they have known for years. Marshall searched his memory. Had they met before? Was she a former employee? A business contact? Someone from a charity event? Nothing came to mind. He was certain he had never seen her before. Yet the longer she looked at him, the more obvious it became that she recognized him immediately. Then something even stranger happened. A smile appeared on her face. Not the smile of a stranger. The smile of someone who had finally found what they had been searching for. Marshall felt a growing sense of curiosity. Who was this woman? How did she know him? And why was she looking at him that way? The questions raced through his mind as the silence stretched between them. Finally, the woman took a slow step forward. Then another. She stopped beside the bench. looked directly into Marshall's eyes, and opened her mouth to speak. The next words out of her mouth would change everything. The woman studied Marshall Oae for another moment before speaking. Marshall. That was all she said. Just his name. Yet hearing it from a complete stranger immediately caught his attention. Very few people recognized him anymore. The newspapers had moved on to newer stories. The business world had found new success stories to celebrate and new failures to analyze. Even people who once followed his career closely rarely looked twice at him now. Yet this woman had recognized him instantly. Marshall sat up slightly. Do I know you? The woman smiled but didn't answer the question. Instead, she reached into her food cart and removed a small paper container filled with hot food. She extended it toward him. Marshall looked down at the meal and then back at her. For a moment, his pride almost stopped him from accepting it. But hunger has a way of stripping away pride. How much? He asked. The woman shook her head. No charge. Marshall frowned. No charge. Again she smiled. No charge. Something about the situation felt strange. Nothing in his recent experience had been free. Every conversation seemed to come with conditions. Every offer seemed to carry an expectation. Yet this woman appeared to want nothing in return. Reluctantly, Marshall accepted the food. The warmth spread through his hands. He hadn't realized how cold he had become. For several moments neither spoke. The woman remained beside the bench while Marshall ate. There was a familiarity in the way she looked at him. Not admiration. Not pity. Something else. Something harder to explain. Eventually Marshall broke the silence. You know my name? I do. How? The woman glanced toward the city skyline in the distance. I've known your name for a very long time. Marshall immediately became suspicious. His years in business had taught him to question unusual situations. People rarely appeared out of nowhere carrying secrets. And they certainly didn't spend their afternoons searching parks for former billionaires. Who are you? He asked. The woman looked back at him. My name is Evelyn. Nothing about the name sounded familiar. Marshall searched his memory again. Employees. Investors. Charity events. Scholarship recipients. Community programs. Thousands of faces passed through his thoughts. Still nothing. I'm sorry, Marshall said. I don't remember. I know. The answer came so quickly it caught him off guard. You know? Evelyn nodded. You weren't supposed to remember. That response only deepened the mystery. Marshall placed the food container beside him. Now he was paying complete attention. Over the past year, nearly every person who approached him wanted something. Money. Help. Connections. Information. Yet Evelyn seemed different. She wasn't asking for anything. If anything, she seemed relieved simply to have found him. As the conversation continued, Marshall learned that Evelyn had spent months searching. After hearing reports about his financial collapse, she began trying to locate him. At first, she assumed he was living privately somewhere. Then she learned he had lost nearly everything. Eventually, her search led her to Marcus Garvey Park. Marshall struggled to understand. Why would a stranger spend months looking for him? What possible connection could exist between them? The answer remained frustratingly out of reach. Every time Marshall asked directly, Evelyn responded with fragments rather than explanations. Small pieces of a larger story. Enough to create curiosity. Never enough to provide answers. Then she asked him a question. Do you remember Chicago? Marshall nodded. Years earlier, before becoming wealthy, he had spent time there while trying to build his first company. Do you remember the winter of 2003? Marshall thought for a moment. Not really. Those years had been difficult. Long hours. Constant uncertainty. Financial struggles. Many memories blurred together. Evelyn seemed unsurprised. What about a bus station? Marshall shook his head. The name meant nothing. What about a little girl? Again, nothing. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly, as if she had expected that answer. Marshall felt frustration growing. The clues were beginning to form a pattern, but he still couldn't see the full picture. A bus station. A little girl. Chicago. 20 years ago. Somehow all of it connected to him. Somehow all of it connected to Evelyn. Yet the connection remained hidden. As the afternoon passed, Evelyn shared more pieces. She spoke about difficult years. Financial hardship. A family struggling to survive. A moment when everything seemed hopeless. Marshall listened carefully. Something about her story felt familiar. Not because he remembered the events. Because he recognized the emotions. Loss. Fear. Uncertainty. He had experienced them all over the past year. For the first time since meeting Evelyn, Marshall sensed that whatever connected them was deeply personal. Not professional. Not financial. Personal. And that realization made him even more curious. Because if he had truly changed this woman's life, why couldn't he remember her? The question lingered between them. Eventually, Evelyn reached into her cart again. This time she removed something different. Not food. Not money. A small worn envelope. Its edges were faded. Its surface marked by years of age. Carefully, she held it in her hands. Marshall immediately noticed the way she looked at it. The object clearly mattered to her. Very much. Then Evelyn slowly extended the envelope toward him. Marshall stared at it. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Almost instinctive. As though whatever rested inside that envelope had traveled a very long way to find him. What is it? He asked quietly. Evelyn's eyes met his. For the first time since they met, her smile disappeared. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried an emotion Marshall couldn't quite identify. It's the reason I've been looking for you. Marshall reached for the envelope. His hands moved slowly, carefully, almost afraid of what he might find inside. Because deep down, he was beginning to understand something important. This wasn't chance. This wasn't coincidence. And whatever truth Evelyn had carried for more than 2 decades was finally about to surface. Then she showed him something he hadn't seen in over 20 years. Marshall stared at the envelope for several seconds before carefully opening it. The paper inside was old, yellowed with age. Its edges were worn from being handled countless times over the years. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then his eyes settled on the handwriting. His handwriting. Marshall's breathing slowed. For a moment, the sounds of the park seemed to disappear completely. He looked at the paper again. There was no mistake. More than 20 years had passed, but he recognized it immediately. Back then, before the business empire, before the magazine covers, before the billions, Marshall had been struggling to survive. Every dollar mattered. Every opportunity mattered. His future was uncertain, and success was far from guaranteed. Yet somehow, despite all the years that followed, this piece of paper had survived. And now it was sitting in his hands. You wrote this, Evelyn said quietly. Marshall continued staring at the letter. Fragments of memory began surfacing. A cold winter. A crowded bus station. A young mother holding a little girl. A look of fear he hadn't forgotten, even if he had forgotten the faces. Slowly, the memory returned. 20 years earlier, Marshall had been traveling for a meeting he hoped would save his small business. Money was tight. He barely had enough for himself. While waiting at the station, he noticed a woman sitting alone with a young child. The little girl looked exhausted. The mother looked desperate. Marshall remembered overhearing part of a conversation. They had nowhere to go. No money for transportation. No family nearby willing to help. At the time, Marshall had his own problems. Plenty of them. But something about the situation stayed with him. Before leaving, he had done something that felt small and insignificant. He purchased bus tickets. He gave them enough cash to buy food. Then he wrote a short note. Nothing dramatic. Nothing profound. Just a few simple words of encouragement. A reminder not to give up. A reminder that difficult seasons eventually pass. Afterward, he walked away and never thought about it again. For Marshall, it had been a brief moment in a difficult year. For Evelyn, it became something entirely different. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the letter. You don't remember us because for you, it was one afternoon. Marshall remained silent. You saved us because you were kind. She paused. We remembered because we had nothing. The words struck harder than anything he had heard since losing his fortune. Evelyn explained that after receiving Marshall's help, she and her daughter had reached relatives willing to take them in temporarily. That single opportunity allowed them to start over. Life wasn't easy. There were still struggles, still setbacks, still years of uncertainty. But they survived. One step at a time, one day at a time. And throughout those difficult years, Evelyn kept the letter. Whenever life became overwhelming, she would read it again. Whenever she felt like giving up, she would read it again. Whenever hope seemed distant, she would read it again. To Marshall, the letter had been forgotten almost immediately. To Evelyn, it became a symbol of possibility. A reminder that even strangers could care. Marshall lowered his eyes. For years, he had measured success through wealth, influence, and accomplishments. Yet sitting on a park bench with $17 in his pocket, he was discovering that one of the most meaningful things he had ever done cost almost nothing. The realization overwhelmed him. His billion-dollar empire had disappeared. His reputation had collapsed. Many people he trusted had walked away. Yet somehow this woman had remembered a small act of kindness from 2 decades earlier. Not because of what it cost, but because of what it meant. For several moments neither spoke. Marshall found himself replaying memories from his younger years. Back when he wasn't wealthy. Back when he understood hardship. Back when helping someone felt natural because he understood what struggle looked like. Somewhere along the journey to becoming a billionaire, those memories had faded. Now they were returning. And with them came a painful question. Had he spent so many years chasing success that he forgot the person he used to be? Evelyn seemed to understand what he was thinking, because she gently placed a hand on his shoulder. That man never disappeared, Marshall. The words hit him harder than any financial headline ever could. For the first time in over a year, Marshall felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope. Not hope for money. Not hope for another empire. Hope that perhaps his life still mattered. Hope that perhaps his story wasn't over. Hope that perhaps losing everything had revealed something more valuable than what he had lost. As emotional as the moment was, Marshall couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. The letter explained why Evelyn remembered him. It explained how their lives had crossed paths. But it didn't explain why she had spent months searching for him. It didn't explain why she seemed determined to find him after all these years. And it certainly didn't explain the look in her eyes every time she mentioned her daughter. Marshall looked at her carefully. "You said this was the reason you started looking for me." Evelyn nodded. "Yes. But it can't be the whole reason." For the first time since their conversation began, Evelyn looked away. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Just heavy. Meaningful. As though she had reached the part of the story she had been postponing. Marshall immediately sensed it. There was something else. Something much bigger. Something she hadn't revealed. And judging by the emotion on her face, whatever came next would change everything all over again. Because she still hadn't told him the most important part. For several seconds, neither Marshall Oae nor Evelyn spoke. The noise of the city seemed distant now. The people walking through Marcus Garvey Park had become little more than shadows moving through the background. Marshall's attention remained fixed on Evelyn. He had spent the last hour uncovering a connection he never knew existed. A forgotten act of kindness. A letter preserved for more than 20 years. A woman who had carried gratitude through decades of hardship and success. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why had she searched so desperately for him? Evelyn took a slow breath. Then she reached down into the food cart one final time. This time she pulled out a plain brown paper bag. Marshall immediately assumed it contained more food. The gesture seemed natural after everything that had happened. But the way Evelyn held the bag told a different story. Her hands trembled slightly. Her eyes filled with emotion. Whatever was inside clearly mattered. Carefully, she placed the paper bag in Marshall's lap. For a moment, neither moved. Marshall looked from the bag to Evelyn. Then back again. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Evelyn smiled through tears. "Something I've wanted to give you for a very long time." Marshall slowly opened the bag. The first thing he found was an envelope. Unlike the older letter Evelyn had shown him earlier, this one appeared newer. The handwriting across the front was unfamiliar. Marshall opened it. Inside was a handwritten message. As he began reading, confusion quickly appeared on his face. The letter wasn't from Evelyn. It was from someone else. Someone named Rebecca. Marshall looked up. "Who's Rebecca?" A warm smile crossed Evelyn's face. "My daughter." Immediately, Marshall remembered the little girl from the bus station. The child whose face had become little more than a distant memory until that afternoon. The little girl whose life had changed because of a decision he barely remembered making. Evelyn nodded gently. "She wanted you to read that first." Marshall returned his attention to the letter. As he continued reading, the emotion in the words became impossible to ignore. Rebecca described growing up hearing stories about a stranger named Marshall. A man who appeared during one of the darkest days of her mother's life. A man who chose compassion when he had every reason to focus only on his own struggles. A man she had never met, but whose influence had shaped her entire future. The letter explained that Evelyn had kept Marshall's note all those years. Whenever life became difficult, she shared it with her daughter. Whenever obstacles seemed overwhelming, she reminded Rebecca of the stranger who proved that kindness still existed. Over time, Marshall's forgotten gesture became part of their family's story, part of their identity, part of the reason they never gave up. By the time Marshall finished reading, his hands were shaking. No award he had ever received, no business achievement, no public recognition, had ever affected him the way those words did. Because for the first time, he was seeing the impact of something that had nothing to do with money. Then he reached deeper into the paper bag. This time he pulled out an old photograph. The image instantly captured his attention. It showed Evelyn, a young Rebecca, and something else. Marshall looked closer. There, standing beside them in the picture, was a small community center. A building he recognized immediately. Years earlier, one of his charitable foundations had quietly funded its construction. Marshall stared at the image. Another forgotten memory resurfaced. He remembered approving the project. He remembered signing paperwork. But he never visited. Never followed up. Never knew what became of it. Evelyn watched as realization slowly appeared on his face. That center changed our lives, she said softly. It helped hundreds of families. Marshall couldn't speak. For years, he believed his legacy was tied to billion-dollar deals and corporate achievements. Yet sitting on a park bench, he was learning that the things people remembered most were often the things he barely remembered himself. Then he noticed there was still one item left inside the paper bag. A sealed folder. Much heavier than everything else. Marshall carefully removed it. The moment he opened it, confusion returned. Financial documents. Business records. Partnership agreements. Investment summaries. Pages and pages of information. Marshall looked at Evelyn. What is this? For the first time since meeting her, Evelyn laughed softly. A laugh filled with relief. That's the real reason I spent years trying to find you. Marshall opened the folder further. The numbers immediately caught his attention. Not because they were enormous. Because they were familiar. Very familiar. Several years earlier, before the collapse, one of Marshall's charitable initiatives had provided funding to support educational and small business development programs in underserved communities. Most of those projects operated independently. Marshall rarely followed their progress. One of those programs had helped fund Rebecca's education. Another had helped support a small business she eventually launched. That business grew, then expanded again. Over the years, it became remarkably successful. Far more successful than anyone expected, including Rebecca. Marshall continued turning pages. The scale of the operation surprised him. The revenue, the growth, the assets, everything. He looked back at Evelyn, completely speechless. Finally, she revealed the truth she had carried for so long. Rebecca had spent years trying to locate Marshall because she believed her success belonged partly to him. Not legally, not financially, morally. She believed the opportunities that transformed her life began with the help Marshall provided when her family had nowhere else to turn. And after learning about his collapse, she made a decision. A decision Evelyn had traveled there to deliver personally. Marshall turned another page. Then another. The realization hit him all at once. This wasn't charity. This wasn't repayment. This wasn't pity. It was something much bigger. Rebecca wanted Marshall involved in the future of the company she had built. Not as a favor. Not as an obligation. But because she believed the man who helped create her future deserved a chance to create another one for himself. Marshall lowered the folder. His eyes filled with tears. For more than a year, every door had closed. Every relationship had faded. Every source of hope had disappeared. Yet somehow, the opportunity now sitting in his hands had come from a place he never expected. Not from former partners. Not from wealthy friends. Not from investors who once claimed to believe in him. It came from a little girl he barely remembered helping. And in that moment, Marshall finally understood why Evelyn had searched for him for so long. She wasn't trying to repay a debt. She wasn't trying to return a favor. She believed something had been left unfinished 20 years ago. And now, sitting on a park bench with the paper bag resting in his lap, Marshall realized that one small act of kindness had quietly traveled across 2 decades before finding its way back to him. His entire life had changed once because of ambition. Now it was about to change again because of compassion. Marshall Oae did not become wealthy again overnight. In many ways, that was the greatest difference between his first rise and his second chance. The younger Marshall would have immediately focused on growth, expansion, and proving himself to the world. The man sitting on that park bench was different. The losses had changed him. The loneliness had changed him. The year he spent watching people walk away had changed him most of all. For several days after meeting Evelyn, Marshall struggled to process everything that had happened. He reread Rebecca's letter repeatedly. He reviewed the documents inside the folder. He thought about the little girl at the bus station. He thought about Claire's words. He thought about all the things he had spent years chasing and all the things he had nearly lost forever. For the first time in decades, Marshall wasn't asking how to become richer. He was asking how to become better. When he eventually met Rebecca, the conversation lasted for hours. She was no longer the frightened child he vaguely remembered. She was a confident business leader. Smart, disciplined, respected. The company she had built was successful, but what impressed Marshall most wasn't the revenue or the growth. It was the culture. The employees genuinely respected her. The organization invested heavily in communities. Scholarship programs supported young entrepreneurs. Families received assistance during difficult times. Rebecca had built the kind of company that measured success differently. And Marshall quickly realized something. Without intending to, she had become the person he once hoped to be. When Rebecca officially invited him to join the organization as an advisor and partner, Marshall accepted. Not because he saw a path back to wealth, because he saw a path back to purpose. The work was different from anything he had done before. Instead of spending his days negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions, Marshall spent time mentoring young business owners. Instead of chasing headlines, he focused on helping people avoid the mistakes he had made. Instead of asking how much money could be earned, he began asking how many lives could be improved. The change surprised everyone who knew him, including Marshall himself. Months passed, then a year. Slowly, stability returned. Not the kind built on stock prices and market valuations. Something stronger. Peace, meaning, perspective. Marshall often visited the same community center he had unknowingly helped support years earlier. He met students receiving scholarships, families rebuilding their lives, entrepreneurs launching their first businesses. Each story reminded him of something he had forgotten during his years as a billionaire. Success means very little if it cannot survive hardship. One afternoon, while speaking to a group of young entrepreneurs, someone asked Marshall a question he had heard countless times throughout his career. What is the most important lesson you've learned about success? Years earlier, his answer would have involved ambition, discipline, or strategy. This time he paused. Then he smiled. The people who celebrate your success aren't always the people who care about you. The room became quiet. Marshall continued. And the people who truly care about you often appear when you have nothing left to offer them. The lesson wasn't theoretical. He had lived it. His fortune had introduced him to thousands of people. His downfall had revealed which relationships were real. As time passed, Marshall rebuilt parts of his financial life. But wealth was no longer his primary goal. The need to prove himself had disappeared. The need to be admired had disappeared. What remained were things he once overlooked. Friendship, purpose, gratitude, time. The simple moments he had spent years postponing. For the first time in his adult life, Marshall felt successful without needing anyone else's approval. Then something happened that surprised him even more. One evening, nearly 2 years after his collapse, he received a message from Claire. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no attempts to rewrite the past, just two people speaking honestly for the first time in years. Claire noticed the change immediately. The arrogance was gone. The constant urgency was gone. The man sitting across from her reminded her of someone she hadn't seen in a very long time. The young dreamer she married before the money arrived. Whether their relationship could ever become what it once was remained uncertain. But for the first time in years, they weren't talking about wealth, business, or success. They were talking about life. And somehow, that felt more valuable than anything Marshall had lost. Looking back, Marshall eventually realized something extraordinary. The worst year of his life had also been the most important, because losing billions forced him to confront truths he had spent decades avoiding. Losing his empire taught him humility. Losing his status taught him perspective. Losing the people who only valued his success taught him who truly belonged in his life. And meeting Evelyn reminded him that even the smallest act of kindness can travel farther than anyone imagines. The billionaire who once believed he had lost everything eventually discovered something unexpected. The things that mattered most had never been inside his bank account. They were the people he helped, the relationships he nurtured, the character he carried when nobody was watching. And that realization became worth more than every dollar he had ever earned. 2 years earlier, Marshall Oae sat alone inside a dark penthouse overlooking the city. The empire was collapsing. The lawsuits were mounting. The investors were leaving. And the woman he loved had just walked out the door. Back then, Marshall believed the worst thing that could happen to a man was losing everything he owned. He believed success could protect him. He believed wealth could secure his future. He He believed the people surrounding him would always remain there. Then life tested every one of those beliefs. Today, the view is different. The city skyline is still there. The streets are still busy. The world continues moving just as it always has. But Marshall is no longer the same man. Years earlier, he measured his worth by the size of his fortune. Now he measures it by the lives he touches. Years earlier, he chased growth without limits. Now he values moments that money cannot purchase. Years earlier, he believed success was something people achieved. Now he understands it is something people become. When Marshall lost his money, he discovered who truly cared. When he lost his status, he found his character. And when everyone else walked away, the person he barely remembered became the one person who never forgot him. The irony wasn't lost on him. The business partners he trusted disappeared. The investors who praised him vanished. The friends who filled his calendar became silent. Yet a woman carrying a 20-year-old memory crossed an entire city searching for him. Not because she needed something. Not because she expected something. But because one small act of kindness had changed the direction of her family's future. And she refused to let the man responsible disappear without knowing it. Sometimes life has a strange way of revealing what truly matters. The things we chase often fade. The things we overlook often remain. A forgotten conversation. A helping hand. A moment of compassion. A choice that feels insignificant at the time. Marshall spent decades building an empire worth billions. Yet the action that ultimately changed his life took only a few minutes and cost almost nothing. That realization stayed with him long after the money, the headlines, and the attention were gone. Because sometimes the people who save our lives are the ones whose lives we changed long ago. And perhaps that's the real lesson hidden inside Marshall's story. We rarely know which actions will matter most. We rarely know whose future we're influencing. We rarely know how far a single moment of kindness can travel. But years later, when everything else disappears, those moments often become the only things people remember. Marshall Oahe thought he lost everything. Instead, he found something far more valuable. A second chance, a deeper purpose, and a reminder that the greatest investments we ever make are rarely financial. They're human. Before we end today's story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think hurt more for Marshall? Losing the billions he spent a lifetime building, or discovering who truly loved him when the money was gone? Let us know in the comments below. And if you think Marshall's story was unbelievable, wait until you hear about the millionaire who spent 10 years searching for the homeless man who once saved his life. That story may change the way you think about gratitude forever. If you enjoy powerful stories about redemption, second chances, resilience, and unexpected twists, make sure you subscribe and join us for our next story. Until next time, remember this. The wealth you leave behind will eventually belong to someone else. But the kindness you leave behind may continue changing lives long after you're gone. And sometimes, when you need it most, it finds its way back to you.